the communists showed that they are now willing to push the world to the brink of a general war to get what they want. This is the real meaning of the events that have been taking place in Korea. This is why we are in such grave danger. The future of civilization depends on what we do, on what we do now, and in the months ahead.
I did nothing nobody else did. Not nobody else did, but that nobody else wouldn't have done. You know, I happened to be there. I'm a witness to it. That's the thing. Now I'm happy I was a witness to it, but I survived. Too many didn't. Too many didn't.
Born on October 11, 1931, in River Grove, Illinois, a northwest suburb of Chicago, Charles Gebhardt attended Anaheim Public Grade School at the corner of Anaheim and Grand Avenue at the Lytton Township until 1945. He then graduated from Lytton Community High School in 1949, where he ran cross-country and played 4 years of varsity baseball. In 1948, he began to work in Franklin Park on the Indiana Harbor Belt Railroad as a trainman.
I got furloughed when there wasn't enough work, and went and played one summer for a Cincinnati Reds farm team in Centralia, Illinois, as a catcher and a center fielder, and got called back to work on the railroad. And then I got furloughed again. They were going to resurrect the draft after World War II, and I called the draft board, said, "Where do I stand?" And they said, "What's your number?" And I told them, and they said, "You're going to be first." So I went and I enlisted in the Army then, thinking I could get into a railroad unit. It was filled up. So I got Signal Corps as a cryptographer. And so I qualified for that with the top secret clearance and all that stuff. My brother-in-law, who had been in World War II, said, "Go to all the schools they offer you. It delays the time." Sure. So I qualified for leadership school. I figured, well, cadre, maybe I could stay right there. That'd be nice. Took that. After that, they said, "You qualify for OCS." And I thought that one over for a couple of days. And I thought, well, Signal Corps, OCS would be at Fort Monmouth. Ivy League stuff. Great. Okay. 4 o'clock in the morning, I get woke up to go on a bus. The bus took me to Fort Benning, Georgia, infantry.
He took basic training and schooling as a cryptographer at what is now Fort Gordon, Georgia, near Augusta, Georgia. He took officer training at Fort Benning, Georgia, which involved ranger training at Camp Rucker, Alabama. At Camp Rucker, Alabama, Gebhardt had to make 3 parachute jumps out of different altitudes and flight levels from a C-46 two-engine plane.
I'd make 3 parachute jumps. I don't recommend them. But you do it because you're there and you got to do it. So you don't hesitate.
After ranger training at Camp Rucker, Gebhardt had 4 to 5 more weeks left of OCS training. However, to be commissioned as an officer, Gebhardt would have to be 21 years old, and he was only 18 years of age. So he ended up having a cryptography military occupational specialty.
We rushed more troops from Japan. Again, we were faced with an emergency build-up to fighting strength. We drew on our citizen soldiers, reserves, and inductees. Within the year, our army would grow from 600,000 to more than 1.5 million men.
They called 2 of us in with the most German names and said, "You're going to the Far East."
Within a matter of days, Gebhardt heard orders from the Far East Command about going overseas.
Well, I told my folks, I said, you know, with my top secret clearance and cryptography and all that, I said, I'm not going to see any combat. You know, I'm not going to be in anything dangerous or anything. Don't worry about me. I'll be all right over there. You know, I'll probably be in a nice office and stuff like that, you know. Well,
He embarked on a 13-day journey with 1,500 other men on the USS Man. They stayed in the bottom part of the ship but tried to find time on deck as much as possible as they went under the Golden Gate Bridge and saw, as far as they knew, the last of the United States of America. After arriving in Yokohama, Japan, he took a train trip to Osaka. He stopped at Hiroshima and saw how the city was marvelously reconstructed only 5 years after the bombing during World War II. Then he went to Iwakuni and was told he was on orders to be flown to Korea. Later, he got in a C-47 two-engine Curtiss plane and flew across the Sea of Japan and landed at an Air Force base between southern Japan and Korea in order to make direction repairs as it was close to the end of monsoon season. Then he flew to Pusan and landed on a K-1 airfield. The runways were made of pure steel planked over dirt to make them more solid. However, to land, the plane came up at several hundred feet without any sort of free roll due to monsoon conditions. There, he went to a makeshift tent and was told he would be assigned to the freshly massacred 29th Infantry Regiment, which just arrived in Korea 2 days before.
And we were driving along, and we went south from Pusan. Well, I thought maybe that's good, you know, because I had heard that and seen newspaper things that the war was more north and west. And so we were driving along, and as it got dark, I could hear some rumbling. I figured, well, that's from the rain. And then I started seeing flashes, you know. It wasn't lightning. This was artillery. And the closer it got, the louder it got, and the more flashing you saw. And the next night, I was put on patrol. This young-looking second lieutenant comes up to me, and he says, Geb, he said, I see you've had some OCS training. He says, you probably know more than I do. I only had ROTC training. He said, and was rushed in here just a couple days, he said, before you got here. And he said, please, he said, understand. He says, I'm not trying to shirk my duty, but he says, you're going to be like almost in charge of this thing tonight. And we went out and we were going along on this patrol, and we were going down into like a valley there, like it was a rice field. And of course, it was very soggy. And the guys were starting out across there, and all of a sudden a flare drops, and we're all lit up. And you didn't know whose flare it was. It could have been ours or theirs, you know. And so everybody is just scared, you know. And so all I did is whisper back to everybody, freeze, freeze. So nothing happened. Flare went out, and we went on. But that was my inception into combat, was that night. They said to go up with the forward observer, artillery forward observer, and to phone back what I observed. So he was to observe what from where our vantage point was on a hill overlooking the Naktong River. And if you ever heard of the Pusan perimeter, which we were at the point of, this is the last stop, there'd be no retreat from here area. And we were down at the very southwest edge of that, where the river turned. They call it the Naktong Bulge. And we were up on a high slope, and we could look down into where the North Koreans had assembled all their vehicles, their tanks and everything. He was observing that, and then if he saw them, or we saw them, and they were starting to move, he would call the artillery, and and give them coordinates of where to shoot at. And he was so accurate. He never asked for a trial shot. He just had them right on every time. When I came back from that and was called into the regimental commander's tent, and with all the officers of the regiment in there, and I started to decrypt it, you know, and the colonel come up to me and he says, "Geb," he said, "Why don't you just read it off to us as you see it? You know," he says, "that'll save time." So I did the best I could with it all and everything, and apparently they got the hang of it all, what they should be doing and how they should do it, and all that, and we were all done. The colonel said to me, "Thank you, Sergeant," and that's the first I knew I was a sergeant.
The Inchon invasion was a key part in pushing back the North Koreans. The attack was daring and ultimately successful, with the 8th Army coming north from the perimeter in coordination with the U.S. Corp, which tied the enemy down in the south. On September 10th, intensive air attacks were put into place, and by September 27th, the assault was over.
Later on, about was less than a week later, I think, we got on board an LST. It's a big landing ship, tank they call it, but I was on that, and it was a rough ride all the way around from Pusan on the southeast end of the Korean Peninsula to go around to the west side and we landed. I landed at Inchon on the 15th of September, and then we were supposed to go and meet the units coming up from the Naktong area, Pusan perimeter, near Suwon, and then the 32nd Regiment was turned and sent to help the Marines secure Seoul, because General MacArthur had wanted to have Seoul in our hands on the 28th of September, which would have been 3 months after the date that the North Koreans took Seoul. Believe me, it was more towards October 1st before the North Koreans were out of Seoul. Some of us went on up north. We went past the 38th parallel and up into, I was on the outskirts of Pyongyang, the North Korean capital. So, and North Korean opposition was almost gone by that time. We could find no North Koreans anywhere.
By 27 October, South Korean troops have reached the Manchurian border on the Yellow River near Chosun, and other UN forces have advanced against virtually no opposition. But on the same day, a sudden, unforeseen factor changes the entire course of the war. Chinese communist troops cross the Manchurian border and help the North Korean Reds drive back UN forces.
On October 7, 1950, General Douglas MacArthur and the United Nations forces crossed the pre-war border of the 38th parallel and advanced towards Pyongyang, while simultaneously deploying the U.S. Corp on amphibious ships towards the Korean Peninsula's east coast. However, MacArthur was not aware of the fact that the Chinese had feared an offensive such as this one since the Inchon invasion, and Mao Zedong had prepared to enter the war by sending supplies and support troops to North Korea. Additionally, Chinese combat divisions advanced and remained in Manchuria and prepared to move against the United Nations Command Force after warning the United Nations several times about their participation in the Korean conflict. Finally, on October 18th through 19th, Mao Zedong commanded the Chinese People's Volunteer Force to move against MacArthur's 8th Army along the border with China at the Yalu River. Meanwhile, President Harry S. Truman and his advisors were notified about a massive Chinese force assembling in Manchuria. Taking into consideration that the Chinese Communist peoples recently claimed control of mainland China in 1949, the Communist Chinese power was new and even fragile, and was sustained with the help of a few hydroelectric plants in North Korea. One of the most vital of these plants was located near the Chosin Reservoir, located northwest of the 38th parallel.
So we picked a place where we would be more or less in command of, we're a defensible position, but a place where we could kick off on the morning of the 28th to move north.
As a result, on October 25, 1950, General Douglas MacArthur's United Nations forces prepared for a quick and victorious end to the Korean conflict, while the Communist Chinese forces stealthily crept their way across the border and attacked the United Nations forces in overwhelming strength. Still, the United Nations forces persisted on with the idea that some of them would be home by Christmas. Toughing it out through extreme cold conditions with temperatures dropping to 35 degrees Fahrenheit below zero without wind chill, the 1st Marine Division of the UXX Corps and parts of the 7th Infantry Division were against odds with the numerically superior Communist Chinese force.
About around 8:30 p.m., I was back at the command post, and about 8:30 p.m., the night of the 27th, we heard some sporadic rifle fire. So we thought, well, possibly some of the Koreans that we had in our unit, these were kids, South Korean kids, shanghaied off the streets of Seoul and the cities of South Korea, handed a carbine, no training, and were sent with us.
The Home by Christmas offensive launched by the 8th Army was supported by the X-Corps attacking west from the reservoir. To assist, Major General Edward Almond formulated a plan on November 21st which involved the 1st Marines Division advancing west along the flank at Udamni and the U.S. 7th Infantry Division forming a regimental combat team to support the eastern flank at Sinhungni. Charles Gebhardt, a member of the 31st Regimental Combat Team of the 7th Infantry Division, guarded the right flank of the Marine advancement towards Mupyongni. Before the battle, however, the 31st Regimental Combat Team was rather spread out among 3 main areas: hills north of Sinhungni, an inlet west of Sinhungni, and the town of Hudongni, located south of Sinhungni. However, the task force was under strength with 1 battalion missing because of the majority of the 7th Infantry Division being scattered around northeast Korea.
That's how that action started there, and lasted all night. They pretty well got between our B and C companies and got the high ground away from them. And but I tell you, that's as scary as can be, because you heard the stories probably of the Chinese with their bugles and whistles. Believe me, it's true. It's true. That's the way they communicated. So we came out by daybreak. The Chinese pretty well withdrew, and we could sort of acquit ourselves as to what had happened to each unit and how many men we'd lost, how many, things like that, and then prepare for future.
The next day, they got hit hard again and found out that the units down by the inlet had been hit hard. So they destroyed all of their unnecessary equipment so they could get to the inlet. While at the inlet, they did receive help from the planes. However, the help was not there all of the time.
We had a Marine captain who was a pilot himself, and he was our air control officer. But whenever planes did show up to see what was going on with us, he could contact him with his radio when they were right above. Captain Stanford would call them when he got them there. Could you give me a strafe over here? Could you give me napalm over there? You know, so on. And what we did is we'd have them call it right in front of us because the Chinese were right there. They were right there, believe me. As I can look at you or you, I could see the Chinese. Believe me, they're that close. They're that close. And these guys, for those more nights there, really took a pasting. It's a sad thing to think about. I didn't think about it. I tried not to for many years of my life. But as I got older, I said, somebody's got to tell the story. You never hear the story of what happened to us there. They really had us surrounded. We had the reservoir, which is a large reservoir, on one side, and the Chinese were around us on the three sides, and even sometimes on the fourth side. And they just hit you in mass. You know, it was relentless on their part. Very wise strategy, no doubt, on their part. They didn't care whether they got killed or not. I mean, their leaders pushed them into it, and they just keep coming at you, always at night. Always at night. Yes, there'd be shooting going on during the day, and you never knew if you were moving. The next one may be for you, you know, during the daytime. But at night, you just knew you were in their sights, or you're lucky if you didn't. I was.
After the 2 days at the inlet, they decided to pack up the wounded in trucks and go the 14 miles back to Hageree to try and get to their tank company and the Marines.
As we started to down the road to head out, we needed ammunition. We were down on ammunition besides all this. And we had to rely on, they brought C-119s in to drop some ammunition to us. But the only thing was, in that weather, it ended up being dropped to the Chinese.
With no ammunition, they blew out a bridge over an ox cart road and slowly made their way around it, making their trucks and the injured men easy targets for the Chinese, with the A Company leading the group, followed by the B Company, and then the C Company bringing up the rear.
But we were just being shot at all the time along the road, and every time we'd make a turn or something, they would set up a roadblock on the road. A couple of these roadblock things would bust them. If you got above them, you could shoot them, and then you'd have to get down and move all the lumber and whatever they could find to make a roadblock, you know, get that out of the way so you could move your trucks around there. And and that's the last time I saw Colonel Faith. We broke up a roadblock, and then he got a hold of a Jeep and was trying to get someplace else, and he got shot, and he was dead. And about that time, everything just went to pot. And most of our leaders, everything were dead, wounded so bad they couldn't lead. We had a major that was crawling on his belly. This is gross. Crawling on his belly with the blood coming out of him. Trying to lead, trying to help. And his blood was going on the ground. It was freezing. You know, blood comes out, it's pretty hot. You ever seen anything like that? Been in a hospital or something? Blood comes out pretty hot. It froze right away. This poor guy was just, he was trying to assemble some kind of leadership, something to keep the guys going. You know, it would have been so easy to have just dropped your weapon, laid down, and go to sleep. It would have been so easy. When this was after Colonel Faith had died, and another major came up to me and he says, "Geb," he says, "see them guys going across the reservoir on the ice?" He says, "There's nothing more we can do here. Our trucks were stopped. They were being shot up. Guys are still being killed. Guys are lying. There's nothing we could do." He says, "We might as well go join them on the ice and take the chance of going across to get to Hageroo on the ice." Yes, I did.
While still being shot at, they walked across the ice for 8 to 9 miles.
And we got back to Hageroo, to where the Marines were. And I remember there was a Marine colonel there, saw us come in, and he chastised us. "You left your men back there." We got back to Hageroo, and I got warmed up, and I got to thinking about what this colonel had said about leaving our guys behind. I told some of the fellows, I said, "Well," I said, "if you get warm enough," I said, "you think you could find your way to, if I got some transportation for you back across the ice," I said, "I think we could go back there and see if we could find any of those guys alive yet." I don't know where they all came from, but there were 46 guys that volunteered. I went up there and I saw a Marine motor pool officer, Colonel Beale, and I asked him about it. And he says, "If you can find anybody nutty enough," he says, "I got to keep these engines running so they don't freeze." He said, "You find enough nuts to go along with you," he said, "I'll take you." That's what we did. We went back there, found our convoy. We got 84 guys back. They were in bad shape, but we got 84 of them back. Whatever happened to them, I don't know.
Since he got sick with pneumonia, he was told to go to Japan and was released by the medics, and then was told to go to the Daiichi building in Tokyo for an interview. He went up to the 14th floor because he was recommended for an award by a Marine colonel for his action in Chosin Reservoir.
Anyhow, I was recommended for they were talking about the Congressional Medal, and I said, I didn't do nothing. And I didn't. You know, all I did is what any of you guys, you're put in a situation any of you would have done. Any of you. And so I played it down. But later on, a couple of years later on, I found out I got the Distinguished Service Cross.
When he came back from Tokyo, he was assigned to the 2nd Battalion of the 27th Infantry Regiment.
I got back there, and I ran into, as I went back to this unit in South Korea, a lieutenant colonel that I had known before, and greeted me, and he says, "Good to see you here." He says, "I was expecting you." And he said, "Well," he says, "you're going to have to report to the colonel." He says, "that you're here." He says, "But before you do that," he says, "here, put these on." He handed me 2 gold bars. And I says, "Thanks, but no thanks," you know. And he says, "You got nothing to say about it." And I was now a 2nd lieutenant.
Later in March, he was located in north-central South Korea on one of the more hilly terrains.
We had a situation where we were expecting the Chinese to try and break through and hit us hard with an offense, what they would call their spring offense. And I looked at the terrain, and I said to the colonel, I says, "Well," I says, "this looks like it'd be something," I said, for like a football action. I said, like use a mousetrap play on them. It was old football, I know, but anyhow, where you let them in, and then you get around them and you just shoot them all to pieces. Well, it's not nice, but that's what happened. And I got the Bronze Star for that. Then I came home from Korea in June '51.
Then he went on to engineer camp at Fort Walters, Texas, and then to Inspector General School at West Point.
Well, Inspector General, my thing was, and I'm not too proud of this. Is you go into a unit and you try to find out what's knitting their brows, you know, what anything that might not be they may not be happy about, you know, and you don't do anything about it. You just report it.
Gebhardt volunteered to go back to Seoul, Korea, to inspect the engineer battalions at the K-14 and K-16 airfields at the Kimpo Fighter Interceptor Base. He had to make sure the new F-86 planes had longer runways for takeoff in order to prevent the napalm-filled planes from hitting the nearby hill and killing the pilot.
After many years, I never talked about, you know, I came back from the service and I didn't talk about my service. Where I worked on the railroad and went back there. The guys that I worked with, these guys, World War II, December 7th happened. They went and enlisted, decimated the terminal, which after the war was over, they had lost jobs because of that. But they did their service. Now, who was I to come back after what I'd seen and tell them anything about anything that I had observed? So after I had or when I was about to retire one day, I was up in a locomotive cab, and I was going to get down and throw some switches. And this engineer I was working with, who was a veteran too, and I put my coat on, my billfold fell out. And he said, "I'll get it," and he picked it up. And it's that my DD-214 I had made reduced down to wallet size, you know. And he looked at it for a while, and he said, "Oh my gosh." He says, "We never heard about this from you." I said, "What's there to say?" You know, here I was 62 years old at the time. And so that's the first anybody that I worked with ever heard about it. But I found out that when somebody talks about, "Oh, we ought to nuke them," or we ought to shoot them, or we go to war, we show them who's the big guy, you know, and everything like that. You talk strong. You know, once you pull a trigger, just think about this always. Once you pull a trigger, and then you get a quick flash to think about it, you can't say, "Oh, whoops." No, somebody's going to get killed or maimed. Nothing beats talking it over, believe me. Nothing beats talking it over. Diplomacy is the best thing before you pull a trigger. This is me. This is what I've come out of it with. Rather than my buddy's laying there with the blood freezing out of him. Rather than that, so much better to come back and talk about it. That's really it. You do things and you take care of each other. You become closer to the guy next to you than your own family, believe me. You become closer, every one of you. And if you lose one of them, any one of them, you lose several of them, you feel it. You feel it. You know, it was hard for me many times to go to a funeral of family people that I knew very well all my life and show a tear. But you know, if I knew a soldier that I'd served with, or if I went to his funeral, Or like I said, I went to this fellow that brought his remains back from Korea here about 5 or 6 years ago. I cried. You know, that's how close you become. You really do. There's nothing that tugs at you more than that camaraderie you've had with those people. That's why I hope to get this story out. And I think there are other guys. I don't care, like I said, what they did in the service. There's a story there for you to learn, to understand, to get out, to listen to.
I first heard about Vet Doc probably last year from my senior friends, and they all told me about how they always had to come in for Vet Doc on the weekends and spring break and winter break and then even over the summer. And I was thinking, what could possibly make a group of high school seniors want to come into school when they don't have to be? At first I was hesitant about doing Vet Doc because I thought it's time and dedication that I don't have. And then I went and saw it at the gala and I cried like a little baby. And then I realized that I have to do Vet Doc no matter what. I would drop any class in order for me to do Vet Doc. And so I did. I think Vet Doc is really cool because you learn about all the battles in history class, but you don't get to learn about what the people actually gave up. In AP US History, I learned about Chosin Reservoir, but then through Vet Doc, I learned about Charles Gebhardt, who was in Chosin Reservoir, and how he saw his friends dying on the frozen cold floor in Korea. But I think one of the main things that Vet Doc has truly taught me is dedication and to make the best out of your situation. Because yes, Charles Gebhardt was in Chosin Reservoir on the east side, but yes, Charles Gebhardt also went the 14 miles back over Hageree to save 84 more men. And through Vet Doc, I got to meet Charles Gebhardt and a whole bunch of other veterans that changed my life. The veterans that I've met through this project are easily the best teachers that I've ever had. They've taught me about the war effort and what they gave up so that I can have the liberties and freedoms and privileges that I have today. My veteran through the Harlem Veteran Project is Charles Gebhardt of the Korean War. Charles Gebhardt is probably the most influential person that I've met in my entire life. He means so much to me, and it's just incredible to be able to have come in contact with him.